greatest civil right you have is to stay alive. Staying alive and being free from random attack is a far more precious civil right than owning a gun.
You ever see, there's another bumper sticker. You ever see those ones that say, we have a daughter on the honor roll at the
Sure, yeah, very proud of their kids.
Yeah, I saw one today. It says, we have a son in public school, hasn't been shot yet.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Andres. I guess I'm the only American here. That's too bad. It would have been more interesting maybe if we had some people disagreeing with me. That would have been interesting. Thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. Like I said, my name is Andres, and before we begin, I'd like to thank my tech person. Thank you very much. I also want to thank the venue. Thank you, 5S Indian Resto. This is the best Indian resto in Davao and the best resto in Davao. So thank you. So if you go to YouTube, let's just get into the video. If you go to YouTube and you search Risky Edges, what we'll be watching Bowling for America, or you can go to the channel itself. Either way, we'll watch Bowling for America. So let's go ahead and start, and then maybe, and then I'll say a few things afterwards, and then we will maybe have a good conversation.
Story about who we are as Americans and why are we the only Western industrialized country that doesn't have free universal health coverage. It's absolutely insane, I think. I know it's kind of a rough go for me, basically. Usually when I make a movie, I made one about General Motors about 17 years ago, and that film said that. But it took 17 years, and at the time, you know, people didn't listen and thought, how could you attack General Motors? They can do no wrong. And then, you know, I made Bowling for Columbine and tried to warn people about the easy access to guns and school shootings. Well, thank you for that. But here we just suffered through another tragic school shooting, and then of course Fahrenheit, where I went out on a limb and suggested that maybe we were sent to war for false reasons. And at the time, took a lot for that too, a lot of grief for that film. And so I'm hoping with this movie that maybe I can catch a break, and people will not just leap on me so quickly and say, you know, well, maybe we should at least listen to him this time. And I think just from the few screenings that we've had, I can tell that the audiences understand one basic thing, that illness and sickness doesn't know any kind of political stripe. This affects Democrats and Republicans, and we've got a huge greedy industry in this country, and there should be no room for greed when we're talking about people's health, and that has to be removed, and we've got to get rid of these profit-making insurance companies.
19 children and 2 teachers were shot dead in an elementary school in Texas in the city of Uvalde on Tuesday. The attack on the Robb Elementary School was carried out by an 18-year-old who attended Uvalde High School. Families have begun sharing the names of some of the victims. They include 9-year-old Uzziah Garcia, 10-year-old Amory Jo Garza, 10-year-old Jose Flores, 10-year-old Xavier Lopez, 10-year-old Annabelle Guadalupe Rodriguez, and 2 4th-grade teachers, Ava Morales and Irma Garcia. Robb Elementary School is a school with about 600 students in just 3 grades, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. The school's about 90% Latinx. Thursday was scheduled to be the last day of class for the year. The school district superintendent, Hal Harrell, spoke Tuesday.
My heart was broken today. We're a small community, and we'll need your prayers to get us through this.
The gunman has been identified as Salvador Ramos. He reportedly bought at least one of his guns on his 18th birthday a few days ago. He was shot dead in the school. Earlier in the day, he shot and critically wounded his grandmother. Tuesday's attack was the deadliest school shooting since the massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut, when a 20-year-old gunman shot dead 26 people, including 20 children between the ages of 6 and 7 in 2012. On Tuesday night, President Biden addressed the nation.
As a nation, we have to ask, when in God's name are we going to stand up to the gun lobby? When in God's name we do what we all know in our gut needs to be done?
The shooting in Uvalde came just 10 days after an 18-year-old self-described white supremacist attacked a grocery store in the heart of Buffalo's African-American community. He shot dead 10 people, all of whom were black. On Tuesday, a funeral was held for 65-year-old Celestine Chaney. Today, the Senate will hold a confirmation hearing for Stephen Dettelbach to head the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. The agency has been without a permanent leader for 7 years. In the past, Dettelbach has supported a federal assault weapons ban and universal background checks. Vigils were held in Uvalde, Texas, Wednesday, a day after an 18-year-old gunman shot and killed 19 students and 2 teachers at the Robb Elementary School. It was the deadliest school shooting in the United States in over a decade. All the victims were in the same 4th grade class. The White House says President Biden will visit Uvalde in the coming days. Meanwhile, chilling details have emerged about the events leading up to the massacre. Officials say the gunman lawfully purchased 2 semi-automatic assault rifles and up to 375 rounds of ammunition just last week after his 18th birthday. On Tuesday morning, he texted a teenage girl he'd befriended online in Germany, writing, "I'm going to shoot my grandmother." Then he wrote, "I just shot my grandma in her head," followed immediately by the message, "I'm gonna go shoot up an elementary school." Police say the gunman shot his way past an armed school security officer, then barricaded himself inside the school for over an hour, wounding 2 police officers before he was shot dead by a Border Patrol agent. Some parents report they tried to storm the school as they waited for police to respond, but were pushed back. The gunman was reportedly in that school between 40 minutes and an hour. On Wednesday, Texas gubernatorial candidate and former Democratic Congressmember Beto O'Rourke interrupted a press conference held by Texas Governor Greg Abbott in Uvalde. Video of the incident shows Beto approaching the stage and telling Abbott, "This is totally predictable when you choose not to do anything." Beto O'Rourke was shouted down by top Texas Republicans and escorted from the room by police. We'll play excerpts of that confrontation after headlines. Governor Abbott has declined to say whether he still plans to attend the National Rifle Association's 2022 annual meeting, which is set to open in Houston on Friday. Texas Republican Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and Republican Senator Ted Cruz still plan to attend, as does former President Donald Trump. He'll be the headliner on Friday night. World leaders continue to react in horror to the latest mass shooting in the United States. At the Vatican, Pope Francis said Wednesday he's heartbroken by the massacre in Texas.
It is time to say enough to the indiscriminate trafficking of weapons. Let us all make a commitment. Let us all make a commitment so that tragedies like this cannot happen again.
Many people here in the UK feel a special bond with the US, and it's painful to see American children killed like this. But a lot of people I've spoken to here also say they're mystified, they're confused, because here and in other countries where there's been a massacre, the government brings in tougher gun control laws, and they cannot comprehend why that doesn't happen in the US.
16 young children and their teacher have been shot dead by a gunman at a primary school near Stirling.
In 1996, the United Kingdom was horrified by the murder of 5- and 6-year-old children by a lone shooter.
I just can't believe something like this has happened.
It was the deadliest mass shooting in British history. And after a grassroots campaign, the government here banned the private ownership of all handguns.
Good evening. All Australians tonight share the horror of the Port Arthur massacre.
In Australia, also in 1996, a lone gunman murdered 35 people. In response, the then Conservative Australian government banned nearly all semi-automatic rifles and shotguns and launched a program to buy back more than 600,000 weapons from those who already owned them.
The greatest civil right you have is to stay alive. Staying alive and being free from random attack is a far more precious civil right than owning a gun.
These are our most popular firearms.
In Australia in 2015, we found the nation's tough gun control laws widely popular, even with this gun shop owner.
I mean, if you were in America, you'd probably sell a lot more guns and make a lot more money.
Yeah, I suppose sometimes it's not all about the money.
From Columbine to Sandy Hook and Parkland, school shootings have broken the hearts of Americans. But there's been no major change to gun ownership laws in the US.
We've got a gun lobby and a corporate gun lobby that has its tentacles so deeply into our political process.
Dr. Jonathan Metzl is a sociologist who told us he's witnessed the gun lobby pressure US politicians into withholding support for tougher laws.
The lesson of those other countries is really that people came together across the political divide.
But were those countries able to do that because they don't have powerful gun lobbies?
100% yes. Definitely yes.
One of the Parkland survivors called out Senator Marco Rubio for taking campaign money from the NRA.
Senator Rubio, can you tell me right now that you will not accept a single donation from the NRA in the future?
And even that didn't change anything.
That people buy into my agenda. And I do support the Second Amendment.
But in New Zealand, another mass shooting in 2019, 51 people killed in 2 mosques, once again prompted legal change outside the US. A ban on military-style semi-automatic weapons and assault rifles. This week, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern explained how they did it.
Now, we have legitimate needs for guns in our country for things like pest control and to protect our biodiversity, but you don't need a military-style semi-automatic weapon to do that. And so we got rid of them.
Australia saw gun deaths plummet after its new laws came into effect. And here in the UK, there are so few guns on the streets that even the police don't generally carry firearms. And ladies, while in the US this year there's been more than 1 mass shooting a day on average, in other wealthy countries they are extremely rare.
In Texas, anger is mounting over the police response to Tuesday's massacre at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, which left 19 children and 2 teachers dead. On Thursday, Victor Escalon of the Texas Department of Public Safety said there were no officers outside the school to confront the 18-year-old gunman, contradicting earlier accounts that a school resource officer unsuccessfully engaged the teen. Escalon also had few answers about the initial police response and why officers took over an hour to directly confront the shooter, even though scores of police officers were on the scene.
Once we interview all those officers, what they were thinking, what they did, why they did it, the video, the residual interviews, we'll have a better idea. Could anybody have gone there sooner?
One mother was handcuffed by a U.S. Marshal as she pleaded with officers to do more to help the students trapped inside the school. Another officer was seen holding a taser to keep angry parents at bay. One law enforcement official told a local news channel some officers went into the school to rescue their own children. Meanwhile, the husband of a 4th-grade teacher killed in Tuesday's massacre died Thursday of a heart attack. 50-year-old Joe Garcia had just returned home from dropping off flowers at a memorial for his wife, Irma Garcia, when he collapsed. Garcia's cousin wrote, "I truly believe Joe died of a broken heart." Joe and Irma Garcia were high school sweethearts who'd been married for a quarter of a century. They leave behind 4 children. In Toronto, Canada, 5 schools were placed on lockdown Thursday as police shot and killed a man seen carrying a rifle near an elementary school. Toronto Police Chief James Raymer wouldn't name the person killed, but described him as a young man in his late teens or early 20s.
Due to the proximity to a school, I certainly understand the trauma and how traumatic this must have been for staff, students, and parents, given the recent events that have happened in the United States.
Students at scores of schools across the United States walked out of classrooms at the stroke of noon Thursday in a coordinated protest demanding passage of gun control laws. In Michigan, hundreds of Oxford High School students assembled on their school's football field, forming a giant U in solidarity with victims of the massacre in Uvalde. 4 Oxford students were killed in November by a 15-year-old gunman. Data from the Centers for Disease Control shows firearms have surpassed motor vehicle crashes as the leading cause of death for children in the United States. On Capitol Hill, Senate Republicans used the threat of a filibuster Thursday to block a bill to combat neo-Nazi and white supremacist violence. 47 Republicans voted against ending debate on the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which would create domestic terrorism offices within the FBI and the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security. This comes less than 2 weeks after a white supremacist gunman killed 10 African Americans at a grocery store in a predominantly black neighborhood of Buffalo, New York. On Thursday, the Senate adjourned for a 10-day recess after failing to take action on gun violence in the wake of the mass shootings in Buffalo and Uvalde, Texas. Democrats rallied outside the Capitol demanding gun control while rejecting Republican calls to arm teachers and school resource officers. This is California Senator Alex Padilla.
And no, putting more armed adults in schools is not the answer. If more guns was the answer, the United States of America would be the safest nation in the world. But it's not.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott has canceled plans to speak live at the annual convention of the National Rifle Association, which opens today in Houston, less than 300 miles from the site of Tuesday's massacre in Uvalde, but he will send a video. 2 other prominent Texas Republicans, Senator John Cornyn and Congressmember Dan Crenshaw, also canceled plans to attend the NRA gathering, as have 4 music stars, Larry Gatlin, Larry Stewart, and Don McLean. Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz and Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick still plan to attend, as does today's featured speaker, former President Donald Trump. The NRA says the Secret Service will prohibit guns inside the Houston Convention Center during Trump's speech.
Plus, we're also heavily militarized, and we exert that upon the world, and we're a bloated, dying empire that can only increase its military budget and provide nothing for its citizenry. And it's natural that if a country's dedicated to militarism, that trickles down to its citizenry regularly. And that's how they feel empowered, because that's how the country shows its power.
Yep. Good night, folks.
We are doomed.
I worked in the firearms industry. I didn't work directly for the NRA, but I worked in the industry that the NRA controlled. I was an executive for a very powerful firearms company. I worked in it for 25 years. I came to realize in the early 2000s that the industry in which I work was taking something that was wholesome to many Americans, a connection to guns and hunting, like I've done with my father and still do with my boys, and they're twisting it into something that was very nefarious and is now ripping the country apart. So I spent the last 15 or 16 years of my career trying to hold true to those old principles at the company I work for, and then trying to tear down the NRA from the inside, because I worried that we were headed towards a place like this. Well, the NRA, many people ask me, why is this so hard? Why can't we get something fixed? What is going on? And it has a lot to do with the AR-15. The AR-15 is many things. It is most of all now a political symbol of intimidation on the right. So it's very deeply entwined in the very identity of the political right and the GOP. And it's also a profit center. It has made fortunes. As late as 15 years ago, the gun wasn't even hardly displayed. It wasn't even shown at industry trade shows. It was persona non grata. But as the NRA cranked up the rhetoric machine, it needed a symbol, and the firearms industry needed profit. and the AR-15 became that. And so it's many things. And the reason it's so hard to address and why the gun issue is so hard to address is because the politics of the NRA and the AR-15 are the politics of our country. So one of the most important, simple things that appears to correct guns, a policy where a lot of people seem to agree, is also just deeply integral to our politics. So we're tackling our entire political system when we attack the guns. I ask you to go back to January 6, 2021, if you can. There were a couple different types of flags there. There were Trump and political flags. And the other type of flag was the come and take it AR-15 flag. You saw guns on lots of flags. When reporters asked the people at the event what they were there, they often said something about politics and then instantly went to guns. The Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, the 3 Percenters, the leading domestic terrorism groups in the country, all centered around gun rights. So the AR-15 is deeply emblematic of the very political radicalization and identity on the right. And if I live in Red America, if you drive around the towns of Red America, you're going to see a lot of Trump stickers. And on almost every one of those trucks or cars where you see Trump stickers, you're going to see AR-15 stickers. Why? Because the AR-15 has become the symbol of the American right. The last time the NRA put profit and politics aside was in the few weeks after President John Kennedy was killed. I was not alive then. So that's been a long time. Now what you're going to see, as has been the case with every mass shooting since 1999, since Columbine, you're going to see a period of relative silence, although they had the convention in Houston last week. And then you're going to see something very important start to develop, which is necessary for the radicalization and the power of the NRA. Once they're being attacked or threatened or legislation is being proposed, they will crank up the fear machine because they will say, because being a victim is a big part of political radicalization. So the NRA will then start to tell their members, we are the victim. Those people are using the death of those kids to take your constitutional rights. Now it's more important for you to stand up than ever. And I don't go so far as to think that anybody at the NRA or anybody that's associated ever wants any kids to die. I will go so far as to say they will quickly pivot and use the proposed legislation and supposed victimization, which I have big air quotes around that, as a way to gin up their base. That certainly will happen. And that's what has to happen. And people like me have to kick down the door and say it will happen. And I believe if we don't do it, this endangers our democracy from several angles. What kid is free who is not free to go to school? Come on. There's nothing free about that. And so this idea, this silliness, this craziness that we are defending freedom by imposing restrictions that make it marginally more difficult for a kid to get a powerful AR-15 and kill those people. It's craziness. And responsible gun owners, I know that they know this. They have been shouted down, though. They have been told to stay quiet. They have been trolled. They have been marginalized. I know because I spoke out and I took the heat for 15 years. They came after me. They ran friends of mine out of the business. They make it very, very clear, you never speak ill of the NRA, especially in times like this, because quote unquote, they're standing up for everybody. But now, after the launch of my book, responsible gun owners, like hundreds of them, thousands of them, are calling me and texting me and direct messaging me saying, I've had enough, I can't take it anymore, I'm a gun owner. I'm like, okay, now's your time. Now we stand up. We have to do this or the country's not going to exist. Well, what the NRA will say is, well, if that kid is old enough to go to war or that kid is old enough to vote, well, he's old enough to have exercise his constitutional rights. And my answer to that is, look, every right must be balanced with decency and responsibility. There is no unfettered right, even all of the rights that are specifically enumerated in the Constitution, speech, religion, I could go on and on and on. None of them are unfettered. And so this idea that by strictly placing decency and responsibility in the form of regulation and norms around a right is somehow unconstitutional and unpatriotic, well, that is craziness, and it is leading us into these horrible places. Nobody can look at what you're showing on the screen now. Those poor kids and families and the town of Uvalde. My God, stand up. And responsible gun owners know this. They just need to be nudged. And I'm sad that it takes this, but maybe this will nudge them. Maybe my book will nudge them. It has to be done.
Before I get into the analytical piece of this, let me just say, you know, our youngest daughter graduated high school this week, and it is not lost on me that in, 8 years, there are going to be 19 families in Uvalde who should be celebrating the same way that we were, who we're not going to get to. And the reason they're not going to get to is because this country loves its guns more than it loves its children. This country loves the ability of an 18-year-old, the day they turn 18, to go buy a weapon of war, than they appreciate the right of a 10-year-old to become 11 or 12 or 13 or 18. So let's be very clear. The difference between Canada and the United States, Australia and the United States, New Zealand and the United States, every industrialized nation in the world versus us, is that we fetishize weapons. And let's be very clear. The historical precedent for that, the reason that we are so obsessed with guns and personal gun ownership going back to the Second Amendment, is because the founders were so afraid that Black people were going to rebel against enslavement, that indigenous people were going to rebel against being pushed off their land and killed and removed, that we wanted to make sure white men could have all the guns that they could possibly possess in order to put down the rebellions of the dangerous racial other. And so the irony is that we now have an incredibly dangerous country for everybody's babies, white babies, Black babies, brown babies, everybody's babies, because white men a couple hundred years ago decided we needed to have all the weapons that we could possibly have and enshrine that in the Constitution to defend against those people. And the irony is that now white folks, white children, white families, just as endangered. We buy all these weapons. In the wake of Obama's election, there was a big upsurge in weapons because folks were, oh, Black dude's the president and they're going to come take our guns. After Ferguson, when Mike Brown was killed, the Ferguson uprising, everyone said, we got to go get all these guns. And the irony is that that increase in gun ownership did not lead to self-defensive use of weapons to prevent, burglaries or whatever. It led to an increase in suicide, an increase in homicide. We are a less safe nation for everybody's babies because of this obsession. And this obsession goes back hundreds of years. So we need to understand the connection between past and present and realize that we are a sick and broken culture. We are not the greatest nation on earth any longer. If we ever were, we are a nation committed to an ideology of death. And if we want to stop that and save our children, we are going to make a change. And I mean, children, students should be walking out of school in the fall, refuse to go to class until your parents and your grandparents do something to protect you. Your parents do not love you enough. Your leaders do not love you enough, and you shouldn't go to class one day until they decide to do something different. A general strike among young people is what is going to end this thing, and it may be the only thing that does that.
The Supreme Court opened its term today with a major action in support of gun control. The court refused to overturn a lower court ruling upholding a tough gun control law in a suburb of Chicago.
Gun groups quickly challenged the law, contending that the Bill of Rights guarantees the right to have a gun. The courts had never before ruled that the Second Amendment bestows such a right on individuals, and today the Supreme Court justices declined to intervene or to rule that the Constitution gives everyone the right to have a gun.
For the majority of American history, the Supreme Court upheld a very different interpretation of the Second Amendment. The court followed a theory that the amendment protected the right of states to maintain a militia, or an individual right to keep and bear arms within a militia, not an individual's right to own a firearm. Retired Chief Justice Warren Burger forcefully argued against that individual theory, pushed by groups like the National Rifle Association in a 1991 interview.
This has been the subject of one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime. Now just look at those words. There are only 3 lines to that amendment. A well-regulated militia. If the militia, which was going to be the state army, was going to be well-regulated, why shouldn't 16 and 17 and 18 or any other age persons be regulated in the use of arms?
But that precedent changed in 2008 when a 5-4 conservative majority opinion written by Justice Antonin Scalia overturned a 1975 Washington, D.C. handgun ban in District of Columbia versus Heller. The opinion was, the operative clause's text and history demonstrate that the Second Amendment connotes an individual right to keep and bear arms. That ruling forced handgun bans across the country to be repealed, including that ordinance outside of Chicago. It also broadened the scope of the Second Amendment, and there is a real likelihood that this 6-3 conservative court will expand that scope again. We are awaiting the court's ruling on a case involving a 108-year-old handgun licensing law in New York. If the court rules against the law, it could have huge implications for concealed carry laws and expand the access and prevalence of guns across the country. Joining me now to break it all down is Joyce Vance. She is an MSNBC legal analyst and a former United States attorney. Joyce, thanks for being here. Let's talk about the legal issues that are going on. In 2008, SCOTUS in the Heller case with a 5-4 decision with that opinion written by Justice Scalia basically said the Second Amendment protects individuals' rights to possess a firearm unconnected to service in a militia and to use that firearm for traditionally lawful purposes like self-defense. But there's that Supreme Court case that we're waiting to hear from, Bruin, that will be decided at the end of this current term. Can you share with us what your thoughts are about some of the implications that are going to come from the court's ruling in Bruin?
Sure. The way I look at it is that Bruin is the logical extension, if you're a Second Amendment supporter, of what happened in Heller. And Katie, it's worth pointing out that at the time the court handed down Heller, which, as you've said, was a 5-4 decision, it was startling. I don't think people seriously expected to see that result, which for the first time, contrary to decades of American history, said you had a right to possess a firearm in your home, that the District of Columbia could not tell you you could not have a gun in your home, couldn't put limits on guns inside of your home. What Bruin does is now it, in essence, says if the court decides in favor of the people who are supporting Second Amendment rights here, the court would say you have a right to possess a gun in public, because that's what the state of New York is trying to do. They're trying to require individuals to have a permit before they can engage in concealed carry. Two of those individuals who were denied permits say, you know, the state of New York shouldn't really be in the business of telling us whether we can carry guns in public. So it would be a dramatic step forward in Second Amendment rights when, if you go back to the basics in Heller, Justice Scalia had to really torture the grammar of the Second Amendment to reach the conclusion he reached. He said, well, this language about right to bear arms is separate from the language about a well-regulated militia, but a plain common sense reading by everyday Americans tells you that that reading that enabled the Supreme Court to reach that result was very, very gymnastically done in order to change the plain meaning of the Second Amendment.
And, you know, Joyce, the irony doesn't escape me that there's often criticism about the idea of a, quote, activist judge basically trying to interpret the law to be able to achieve a result, which sounds like is exactly what happened with Justice Scalia. But after the shooting that just happened a few days ago in Uvalde, there have been renewed calls to repeal the Second Amendment. And we heard the actual text of the Second Amendment, and it says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Joyce, it's not a complicated amendment. It's not complicated language at all. I mean, why is it that we are getting this very tortured interpretation of the Second Amendment? And frankly, do you think there's any credence or idea that the Second Amendment could be repealed at this point?
That tortured amendment, or rather interpretation of the amendment, is likely fueled in large part by money that the NRA put into the issue. There was strong lobbying to politicize this issue. You know, decades ago, it was police chiefs and sheriffs who didn't want to see an end to the ban on assault weapons. They understood that would make our communities more vulnerable. Somehow the NRA managed to change that national conversation, and that leads us to where we are today. So you ask about repealing the Second Amendment, which I know is being suggested in some quarters. That's been part of the conversation ever since the Heller decision was handed down. Let's set aside for the moment the fact that it's highly unlikely that that would ever actually happen. It's in many ways not desirable because of that pre-Heller interpretation of the Second Amendment, which does guarantee that states can have well-regulated militias and that firearms can be stored at these buildings that we see in states that are labeled armories, places where we store guns for our militias that are there to protect us. That's very different from saying that you have a right to carry a gun wherever you want to out in public. That's the path that Heller set us on, the path that many of us fear Bruen will continue to walk down.
But the founders, right, Joyce, they never anticipated this idea of 18-year-olds going and obtaining AR-15s to execute 21 innocent lives in the span of minutes. There's a very kind of difficult conversation to be had about the idea, about the evolution of this living, breathing document, which is supposed to be the United States Constitution. We have a conservative SCOTUS majority right now. Do you believe that any efforts that are made to be able to advance significant gun reform legislation on a federal level is going to survive if it's challenged and it's before this current makeup of the Supreme Court?
That's really up to the voters in large part. Yes, the Supreme Court will play a role in reviewing whatever laws are put forward. But if you take Heller as the state of the law, Heller still allows states to do a lot. There's no conflict with Heller in permitting, for instance, universal background checks. Heller explicitly carves out the ability for states and for the federal government, which does this extensively, to regulate the types of guns you can own. For instance, it's illegal to have a fully automatic weapon. It's illegal to have a sawed-off shotgun. So those sorts of restrictions could remain in place. There's no reason to believe the court wouldn't permit states to regulate ownership so that people under 21 would be unable to purchase a firearm. And of course, there was, at this point prior to the Bush administration letting it elapse, there was a ban on high-capacity magazines, these magazines that let, for instance, the shooter in Las Vegas continue to shoot, I think, 100 rounds at a time without having to stop to reload. And prior to the end of the ban during the Bush administration, people understood how critical it was that those moments that would force a shooter to take time to reload gave law enforcement the opportunity to intervene. So without really doing anything that should convince this Supreme Court that it's out of balance, it would be possible to enact those sorts of restrictions. That's, of course, why this issue needs to remain on the front burner for voters when they go to the polls in November.
The latest unspeakable act of gun violence in this country.
Uvalde, Texas.
An AR-15 rifle.
Buffalo, New York.
The alleged gunman purchased the AR-15 style weapon legally.
And of course, Newtown, Connecticut.
The AR-15 was used at Sandy Hook, was used in Aurora, it was used in Clackamas. Can I go right now and buy one of these myself without much of a check and go pick one up?
Sure you can.
Again. All of it. Again.
After 19 children and 2 adults were gunned down at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, we're told by Republicans not to politicize this tragedy. They tell us not to bring up the fact that we have more guns in circulation in this country than we have people. They tell us not to bring up the fact that our country has more guns per capita than any other country in the world. They tell us not to bring up the fact that weapons of war that can be so easily purchased by an 18-year-old who can't even buy a beer. Republicans tell us that we can discuss anything and everything after a mass shooting. We could talk about the shooter, the victims, the culture, even the school doors.
One of the things that everyone agreed is don't have all of these unlocked back doors. Have one door into and out of the school, and have that one door armed police officers at that door. If that had happened, if those federal grants had gone to this school, when that psychopath arrived, the armed police officers could have taken him out, and we'd have 19 children and 2 teachers still alive.
Yes, Senator Ted Cruz would prefer that we talk about how many doors we have in schools across this country. But how dare we discuss the guns that kill? How dare we bring politics into this tragedy? But how can we not? The inconvenient reality is these tragedies keep happening because it's a political choice. The number of school shootings is rising. Already in 2022, there have been 27 shootings at schools. Since 2018, there have been 119 school shootings with multiple casualties. More than 300,000 children have experienced gun violence in schools since the Columbine High School massacre in 1999. And there's been no action taken by our lawmakers in Washington. Here's a list of Republican lawmakers receiving money from the gun lobby. Senator Ted Cruz, chief among them, has directly received over $442,000 from gun rights groups. Representative Steve Scalise of Louisiana took $396,000. Senator John Cornyn of Texas received $340,000. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, $284,000. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, $247,000. And then there's the millions of dollars in indirect campaign spending. Senator Mitt Romney has received over $13.6 million from the NRA, according to the Brady campaign. Senator Richard Burr, nearly $7 million. Senator Roy Blunt, $4.6 million. Senator Tom Tillis, about $4.4 million. Senator Cory Gardner, nearly $4 million. But of course, Washington, D.C. isn't made up solely of Republicans. Democrats control the White House and both chambers of Congress. There are two Democratic senators, Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who can join their fellow Democrats and banish the filibuster in order to pass gun control legislation. They can pass H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2021, which would expand federal background checks for all gun purchases. 8 House Republicans supported this bill, with 1 Democrat voting against it. But surprise, surprise, the bill is stalled in the Senate because all 50 Republican senators don't even want to consider it, and because 2 Democratic senators don't want to change the Senate's rules. After every tragedy, whether it's the mass shooting in Buffalo, New York last week, or in Newton, Connecticut 10 years ago, we reach the same political impasse. There's the initial rage and grief from the public, the speeches from our lawmakers, and maybe a few bills are introduced in Congress. But then politics, the very thing we're not supposed to talk about, inevitably prevents any sort of federal action to address the gun violence. So my question is, are we just shouting helplessly into a political void? Or are we ready to make a different political choice?
No other country murders its own kids. There are no mass shootings in schools in any other country. The mainstream media creates an illusion that covers the whole country as if like we do everything the best. No, there are some things we literally do the worst.
A lot of things we do the worst.
We have a mass insanity in this country where we go, oh, dead, murdered children all over the streets. Oh, at least we have our guns.
Yep.
The other countries do gun control. So this guy who killed everybody, he's 18. He can't buy a beer, but he can buy an AR-15 and murder your kids. And everybody thinks that's normal, and not a single politician is going to do anything about it.
Okay, so that was that was Bowling for America. That was the documentary. Thank you everyone for coming and watching. This week is the first Father's Day since Uvalde. It is 4 weeks. This week will also be 4 weeks since Uvalde, and this week will also be 1 month since Uvalde. I'd like to say some things that were not mentioned in Bowling for America, and maybe that will help get the discussion going. First, years ago, I was a history teacher. And afterwards, I was a paralegal. So I'm familiar with both history and law. The Second Amendment was never about individuals owning guns. It was written when we were afraid that England might conquer us after we became independent. And 19 years after we became independent, we went to war with England again, and England burned the White House. And we eventually won that war. Now, the National Rifle Association, the NRA, didn't even exist until 85 years after American independence. And even then, the NRA was not about individuals owning guns. It was about marksmanship, the art of firing a rifle accurately. The NRA did not become a political organization until 1977, 45 years ago, when a group democratically took over the NRA and started the American individual gun ownership movement. So this whole idea that the Second Amendment and the NRA are about individual gun ownership, it's only 45 years old, this idea. And the Supreme Court never said that the Second Amendment guaranteed an individual gun ownership until 2008. So the Supreme Court ruling that the Second Amendment is about individual gun ownership is only over 10 years old. The second thing I wanted to say is that I do not come from a law enforcement background, but I think one of the takeaways from both Columbine and Uvalde is that cops should not establish a perimeter first. They should breach immediately. In other words, if you're the only cop at the scene of an active shooter in a school, go in and kill him before he kills others. Don't wait for backup. Maybe he'll kill you first, but at least he kills a cop and not a civilian. And maybe by the time he kills you, backup has arrived, and maybe they'll kill him before he kills anyone else. I also want to say something that the American writer and my favorite writer, Chris Hedges, has been writing about for over 10 years. There are a lot of white people in America who have lost everything. They've lost their jobs, they've lost their homes and their families, and that's one of the reasons they want to hold on to their guns, because that's the only power and control they feel they have left. Take away their gun and they lose more than everything. And lastly, thank you all very much for coming. It is necessary for democracy that we put down our phones and meet in person in reality. I'm thinking of the words of the American playwright and director, Karen Malpede. The theater needs to be funded with public money, as it was in Athens, where it began, and where all citizens were required to attend the dramatic festival, because the theater is, when it functions, a corrective against the excesses of empire. As such, it remains necessary to the functioning of a democratic state, and though it might make the functionaries of such a state uncomfortable, it will and must be a beacon of truth. At its best, such a theater provides the experience of heightened feeling, heightened aliveness, heightened awareness of self and other. It makes us more human and humane, and therefore more able to take action in the world. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, and with that, let's get into questions. If there are any questions or comments. Yes, okay. So this gunman who killed these children, why did he do that? Very good question. The vast majority of these gunmen in America are white, male, young. They have almost no friends. They don't have a girlfriend, and they have a anger toward women in general. So instead of talking about their feelings to a therapist, perhaps, or talking to somebody, not all men in this demographic, but a lot of them, they choose to get a gun and instead of dealing with their problems, taking out their frustrations on all of these innocent victims. Well, that's another thing. Some of them also have financial hardships. In this case, in Uvalde, he was not white. He was Latino, like myself. For Uvalde, I have not seen, but sometimes it is racial. In Buffalo, there was a white man who called himself a white supremacist, and he went into a black neighborhood and he shot and killed, he went in there with the intention to shoot and kill black people. There's a mass shooting in the United States every day, which is defined as a shooting where 4 or more people are shot. And so there are so many examples, sadly, to choose from. But Dylan Ruth, a few years ago, was a young white male who called himself a racist, and he went into a black church on a Sunday in the middle of service and started shooting. And he said, he left a note, he survived, but he said he wanted to start a racial war. So in some of these cases, it is racially motivated. I would not say the motivation is more racial than anything else. I would not say that. I would say the basic motivation is that this is oversimplifying. These young men are unhappy, and I know that sounds oversimplistic, and it is, but some of these young men, not all unhappy young men are gonna go out and kill people, but when you have all these unhappy young men and it's easy to buy a gun in America, which it is, it's easier to buy a gun than a car. In America, you have to take a driver's test, get a driver's license, then you go buy a car. You can, as long as you're 18 in some states, I shouldn't laugh, but if you're 18 in some states, you can just buy a gun. So the majority of them are men, and the motivation is that they're just unhappy, and instead of getting therapy or instead of getting help, they take out their frustrations on these innocent victims. We talked, it was mentioned a little bit in the video that when you talk about guns in America, you're talking about the entire political system. Now, that observation is exactly on point. We're the richest country in the world. Why do we have all of these young men who are unhappy? Well, there's a lot to go in there. And yes, we're the richest country in the world, but that only means that the GDP and the stock market is high. The truth is, before COVID, homelessness was increasing. Europe, Canada, Japan, they all have a similar program where everyone's health care is either completely paid for by the government or partially, or there's some kind of system where not all systems are the same. The British system is not the same as the French system, for example, but they all result in everyone being able to go to the hospital. Nobody in these countries says, I can't go to hospital, I don't have money. America's the richest country in the world. We don't have anything like that because the privately owned hospitals and the private prescription drug companies want to make more money, and they will in America, by saying healthcare is a product I can sell, as opposed to Canada, Europe, and Japan, who say, no. Healthcare is a basic human right. We have to provide this to people, like we provide law enforcement, fire departments, military. You don't pay for the fire department to help you. You don't pay for public school teachers to teach you. You could argue, well, I do pay for that in my taxes. Okay, but Canada, Europe, and Japan have found ways to make education, law enforcement protection, fire department protection, and education and healthcare rights. And so the simple answer to your question is, it's not a right in America. The number one reason Americans go bankrupt is because they cannot afford their medical bills. If you can believe that. The NRA is very powerful. These private hospitals, these private companies that own these private hospitals and own the pharmaceuticals, they're very powerful, meaning they will donate to the campaigns of these politicians so that even when the politicians say, elect me, I'll give you health care, it won't happen. Trump, it's corruption. It's corruption. Trump said, I'm going to give everybody health care. He didn't. Now, he was only president for one term, so maybe you could argue, oh, he didn't have time. Our country, the United States, and not only the United States, but the United States has a long history and tradition of civil disobedience. One would argue that that's how we became a country. We disobeyed, we broke the law, we disobeyed His Majesty and became our own country. Dr. King led boycotts and peaceful, non-violent law-breaking for civil rights. And most recently, Chris Smalls, he's just an ordinary guy working at an Amazon fulfillment center. He's not college educated, I don't think. He didn't go to university, I don't think. But he organized his workplace to get better working conditions. So what Americans need, and it's no guarantee that it will succeed, and it is not easy. It's much easier said than done. But in the new tradition of people like Chris Smalls, we need sustained civil disobedience. Like another example, what was mentioned in the video. In America, their schools are on summer break. First day of school, teachers and students in all the public schools, all the schools period, should just say, we're not going to school, we're staying home until, better yet, we're not going to school, and we are in fact instead going to fill the streets with our bodies so no cars can get through, no traffic can get through, the economy will stop, the country will stop, until, for example, that you meet our specific demand. One specific demand can be abolish the Second Amendment. Yes, I know exactly what you mean. So let me say two things. The first thing is, America also has a tradition, and not only America, of things changing. We'll never end slavery. Yes, we will. Women will never be able to vote. Yes, they will. We will always segregate the white people from the black people. No, we won't. There'll never be a black president in America. Yes, there was. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing, these people who you're talking about, I mentioned them earlier, Americans who are clinging to their guns now more than ever because of economic hardship. Chris Hedges, who I mentioned earlier, has been saying this for over 10 years. If we reintegrate these people into the economy, they will be a little less angry. You know, a lot of these gun owners, like who you were talking about, would they feel the need for that gun so much if they had a high-paying job? Would they feel the need to have a gun so much if not only did they have a high-paying job, but their spouse didn't need a job and they could afford to send their kids to college without taking loans if their kids wanted to go to college, and if they could afford all of their medical bills, a previous topic we touched on. You know, if all of those things were happening with these gun owners, would they really feel the need to have that gun? Would they be so angry? I mentioned earlier the majority of these shooters are young, white, male, no friends, almost no friends, no girlfriend, and a general anger toward women. Would they be a little less angry if they had more money? Well, let me ask this: what are the what are the gun laws here in the Philippines? Like, if I'm a citizen of the Philippines, my grandparents are Filipino, my parents are Filipino, I'm Filipino, and for whatever reason, I wanted to buy a gun. For whatever reason, how would I go about that? If anybody knows, buying a gun here in the Philippines. Okay, that difficult? It's difficult. A lot of The little joke, but everything in the Philippines is difficult, right? Paperwork, go to City Hall, this clearance, that clearance. Yeah. So I think we have time just for one more comment or question. I do personally believe abolishing the Second Amendment will work, but the other question you're asking, I think, is how realistic or how soon will that happen? But there are many things we can do. Let's assume for the moment that the Second Amendment will always be there. Let's assume that. We can do things without abolishing the Second Amendment. We can register all gun purchases. We can raise the age from 18 to 25. We can have a universal background check. And we can ban not all guns, but maybe certain kinds of guns, like the AR-15, which was used. So abolishing the Second Amendment is not the only option. I'd love to continue. I could go on all night, but we're out of time. So again, my name is Andres. My channel is Risky Edges. Please share, please comment, please like, please subscribe and turn on bell notifications. Thank you everybody for coming. Terrific discussion. Maybe we can do this again sometime. Thank you very much.
The greatest civil right you have is to stay alive. Staying alive and being free from random attack is a far more precious civil right than owning a gun.